did pick up this wonderful book, Deerskins to Buckskins, that seems like it's a pretty good resource. So I'm just gonna do what they say and see if I get a usable deer hide out of it, then maybe I can make something. Perhaps I will just be wearing skins with a year-long beard. If skinning is step number 1, I guess this would be step number 2 of brain tanning your deer hide. You're going to need a beam that's about 6 to 8 inches in diameter. I didn't have a good wooden beam just laying around. I did have this PVC laying around at 6-inch PVC, so I'm going to try and use that. Cut that about as tall as you are, so this one's 6 feet long. And you're also going to need a scraping tool. Your scraping tool should be a good 6-inch scraping surface, and also have very comfortable handles. This is water heater hose that's wrapped around some duct tape, and then the actual scraper is an old samurai sword that I found laying on the ranch. And so this samurai sword had a sharp edge, and I took down that sharpness because you want a defined edge but not sharp. You don't want to be able to cut yourself, but you want to scrape real easy. So see, there's no way I'm going to cut myself if I do this, but I can still feel that there's a defined edge there. Let's do this. Here's our deer hide. So step number 2 is to get all the flesh off of the inside of the hide. Ooh. I've never done this before, so maybe I'm not the best person to explain, but I believe you just fold over the end of the hide, pinch it with your stomach, and then you just scrape down and out. There you go. See how that flesh is coming off? There you go, my hide is completely fleshed. That was really easy. That stuff just came right off. When you're fleshing, you don't really need to worry about every little bit of flesh and membrane, because we're going to membrane the hide later, and that'll take all that off. It took about 15 minutes. Now, since the bucking process is going to take almost a week, we're going to have to store the brains somehow, because otherwise they'll rot in that amount of time. So apparently what the Native Americans did was that they took the brains out of the skull, mixed them with moss, and then dried them. So you can see this hillside has a lot of dried up moss on it. So I've just been picking all this stuff up. You're gonna need some kind of oils, and it is convenient that the brain of whatever animal you plan to tan has pretty much the exact amount of oils you will need for this process. Unfortunately, it's inside the skull of this deer, so I'm gonna try and get it out, and I think I'm gonna try and use a hammer to do this. I don't expect this to be enjoyable or pretty, but here we go. Got my brains, here's my moss. Apparently it takes 4 times as much moss to brains is the ratio we're going for. So now you just take the brains and get it in the moss and just work it all in there. So you gotta do this because the brains on itself just won't dry out. It forms a little membrane on the outside, and then the inside stays wet and rots. But apparently if you mix it in with the moss, you really increase the surface area, and thus the whole thing can allow it to dry and then preserve your oils. So that bucket's about half full, and you always want to keep some extra ash in case you need to make it stronger. Now we're going to add our water. I've added ash until I've got a milkshake-like consistency. Apparently this is important because if it's too wet, you won't have enough alkali, and if it's too dry, you won't have enough water and it won't be able to permeate the skin. And you want to make sure all surfaces of the hide are coated in your ash mixture. You can see that the hide is evenly coated with the ash. So now I'm going to put it in here, get out any air bubbles. I'm going to make sure it's all the way under the ash, and then I'm going to make sure it stays that way by weighting it down with a brick. Lastly, put the lid on, and then we're going to let this soak about 4 days, and it won't hurt to soak a few more days, but supposedly you shouldn't let it soak more than 10 days. So ingraining, what we're doing is we're going to take out the hair, the epidermis, and then the grain, which is under that. And you want to go with the hair because otherwise you'll shear off the hair and you'll get little black spots in your hide. Alright, you can see I've wedged my beam against my car tire there. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap the skin over the top of the beam, press against it with my chest here, and then go down, in, and scrape down. And what we want to do is, see, this is just taking away the hair here. That's like your most common mistake. See, we want to take away that hair, but then also take away the layer underneath it. Alright, there, you see that? You see how there's another layer under there? There's like the hair, the epidermis, and there's the grain. So that's what I'm taking off now. And you want to just start in one area and just start working your way around. That way you know you don't miss any spots. You can see how this is raised up. You can really see the difference between what you want, the hide on the bottom and this membrane on top. You just gotta dig down in there, get it off. So when you get to the edge, you're just going to scrape down hard and just straight off onto your beam. What a transition. That thing went from a super stinky mess to something that almost looks like a hide already. It's time to soak this to remove all the alkalinity and get the swelling down. So typically overnight is good, I guess, in regular running water. The colder it is, the longer it'll take. I am fortunate enough to live right over this big redwood canyon, which means there's a creek down there, Finnegar Creek. And so we're going to take this and throw it in there. So there's a little pool here. Now I'm just going to throw this hide in there. Get a rock. Set the rock on it. Hopefully if we come back tomorrow, hide will be all rinsed out. You can leave it in here for a couple days, no big deal. The bacteria has really been in an alkali environment, totally sterile. So it'd take a long time for it to build up, but I don't want to leave it more than 2-3 days. Alright, now that we've rinsed our hide, you'll notice it's white. That tawniness is gone, that yellow-brown. See this little stuff? I think that's the membrane there. So that's what we need to take off. You can see the different layers. There's a membrane here, and this is what I've scraped off. So this is all the membrane. If we don't get this off, it's going to inhibit the brains dressing in there, and also the smoke from smoking it and making it soft. So it's important to get this stuff off here. And you know, you can leave little tiny scraps behind. So you're gonna need a bar. You're basically gonna wrap your hide over the bar, and then you're just gonna hand wring out any extra water that you've got in here. Wringing is important because if it's totally dry, the hide won't absorb the oils. So your brains won't get inside the hide. And if it's too wet, then the water is in where the brains want to be. And so the brains can't penetrate into deep within the hide. Alright. Now that this is all hand wrung, undo it. Open it up. If you do this and get a really even wringing, your hide will be evenly soft and wonderful. If it's uneven and you end up with patches of water in there, those spots will end up a little bit hard. So the neck of the hide is going to go over the back. It's going to hang down all the way until the tail of the deer, which is right here, is about 6 inches over the bar. Then we're going to take the neck and loop it back up so it just hangs over the top like that. Now that that's done, we're going to start wrapping from the outside and just rolling these guys in from both sides until they meet in the center. Next up, you're going to need some kind of a stick to wring this thing out with. Choose something sturdy. You got a pick handle here I had laying around. If it's a thin hide, you want to wring almost as hard as you can. If it's a medium or thick hide, you can really wring it until nothing drips out. This is a thinner hide, so I could potentially tear it. The reason that I know that this is a thinner hide, even though I've never done this before, is that both does and younger deer have thinner hides, and this was a young doe. So now that we're back to our original starting point, we need to do that 4 more times. So we need to roll this loop over a quarter of a turn each time. Then we're going to stretch both directions. And we're going to roll it a quarter more, stretch both directions, quarter more, stretch both directions, until we've done it 4 times, going in 8 directions. After wringing, it's time to stretch this thing all out. And you can see here, these kind of areas right here, the bluer areas, are areas where it didn't get dried out really enough. And the white areas where it's stretched, and the like kind of yellowish tawny areas is where it's dry and good. So if you just leave these areas, those will end up being hard spots because the brains won't be absorbed in there. It's going to absorb those brains, so this stretching helps it absorb the brains, but you can also leave it in there longer. So if you don't stretch it as well, you can leave it in there overnight and it'll make up for the not stretching. If you stretch it really well, then you only have to leave it in there for like 20 minutes and it'll absorb it. Been stretching this hide for about 20 minutes. Just going belly to belly and then neck to tail. You can see that all those weird stretch marks are pretty much gone now. But I don't want to do this too long because you don't want your hide to dry out or you have to re-wet it and then wring it all over again. To prepare our dressing, we're going to need a ½ gallon. You basically want it as hot as you can get it. If it's too hot for your hands, then it's going to be too hot for the hide. So that feels like a nice hot bath right there. So I'm going to take my brains and moss and just add that in there. And all the oil right now is just coming out of that moss. It's starting to get milky here, which is what's supposed to happen. So once you're convinced you've got all the brains out of there, you just pick it up and just squeeze all the water out of the moss there and wring it out. Just going to put that in there. It's really important that every piece of the hide gets exposed to the brains. Apparently it also helps to massage and stretch the dressing into there. Now that your hide's been sitting in the dressing for a while, the whole thing should feel slippery and slimy, which it does. Make sure you save your brains. We're going to need these again. Alright, to test if we've got good brain penetration, pull it from side to side. See how it stretches? So if it's got good stretching all the way through, then we've got good penetration. If there's any weird puckering, then you know that that's a spot that isn't penetrated by the brains, either because of poor bucking or because it was too wet or too dry. If there is puckering, just try and get in there and work it out, and then put it back in the brains. Let it sit for another 5 minutes. Now it's time to stretch this thing back and forth in every direction. Make sure it's over your pot so you catch it. So again, we're going after all the kind of blue spots. See how that water's in there? You're either trying to squeeze that preferably off the edge or to redistribute it to a really dry yellow tawny spot. Now that we've stretched the hide, we're going to redress it in the brains for the second time. Try and stretch the edges by just pulling your fingers off there. The next step, the second to last step, is softening. In this step, basically, you're going to continually move the hide so that the bonds can't just like lock down and glue together as it goes from damp to dry. So the wetter it is, the longer it will take you to soften it. So we're going to do one last wringing to try and get all that moisture out, and then we'll move on to the softening process. Alright, so now we've squeegeed out our hide. Basically, we're going to start by just stretching this thing out. You just got to keep stretching it until it's totally dry. The edges are going to dry first, so we're going to focus on those first. See, I've set this cable up around these branches so that I can get my hide around here. And you don't want to stretch it when it's all bunched up, but you can stretch it like this, you know. And also the cable helps to abrade the surface. You need to keep the surface abraded, otherwise the surface will dry and crust and the inside won't, and then the inside will become hard. Alright, it took about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And you can see I now have something that is very soft. If left this way, the buckskin would be wonderful until it got wet, and then it would start to re-glue and get all nasty again. So the last step to make it waterproof, so you can actually wash your buckskin and have it in soaps and whatnot, is to smoke it. So let's do that. So we're just going to go around the very outside edge and just cut off whatever is tough and just leave nice soft buckskin. After you've trimmed off the edge of your hide, you want to save all these little cuttings because you can actually make hide glue out of these apparently, which is useful for all kinds of things, including gluing your skin before smoking, which we're going to do with some Elmer's glue for now. Alright, I've got my hide here. It's laid out, the neck down and the grain side up. You just keep going along the edge until it starts to get tacky, and then you fold it over and continue on. So now we basically turned our hide into a pillowcase. It's closed on the top and all the way down the side, and it's open on the neck at the very bottom. You want to cut 2 little holes on the kind of high points on the extreme outer edge. Go for one right here, and then one up here. In order to make a nice smoky fire, we're going to use punk, which is basically rotten wood. It'll burn and create coals, but it's going to be super smoky. So that's what I'm collecting now. I'm going to start with a nice, good layer of nice hot coals. Alright, layer of punk, layer of coals. We're just going to put our hide on this thing. Now we want to make sure that no areas are touching. Make sure all this stuff's open up so the smoke can get to every little area here. See, this is good. It's not really smoking around the edges. There's just a little bit coming through where I poked that hole. As you're smoking, you gotta keep adding layers of punk, and it just keeps coming up and up. And that new punk becomes the coals. And the punk also keeps it from flaring up and actually burning. Alright, I've smoked both sides for about 45 minutes each. And I think the inside is about the same color as the outside now. See? Looks pretty good. So let's take this thing down and open it up. See what we got here. There you go. One finished buckskin. Fuck, I don't know what I'm doing. Zombies are coming from miles around, smelling my brains. No! I can tell you that graining really isn't something you want to do. There's a fucking huge blister on your hand. Take good care of your hands. You're gonna need them. Oh! Brain in the eye. Ugh.